So you guys know that Iran already lost, right? We are at the same point with this country that we were with Iraq back in 2003. The country's foreign policy has been completely defeated. It is at our mercy, and it is begging to do deals with us. The only way that we could screw this up would be by getting into another $1 trillion war in the Middle East. It would be absolutely ridiculous to get into a war with Iran again at this point. Even Donald Trump knows this. In fact, there are elements of the Donald Trump administration that seem to know this much, much better than the mainstream media, which is often advocating for war. For 45 years or so, Iran threatened U.S. interests in two main ways: with militias in Lebanon and Syria that threatened our Israeli client state, and with the potential that they might at some point develop a nuclear weapon. These militias have been defeated. They're not completely destroyed, which is essentially impossible, but their corridor through Syria is gone. The Assad regime that facilitated these actions, that was part of the fabled Shia Crescent, is gone. And Iran is currently basically begging to do a deal with us to limit the potential of their developing nuclear weapons. Iran is a solved problem. But the same brain-dead Washington, D.C. idiots want to do a $1 trillion war instead. Essentially, it was too easy. They want to use their weapons, so they're going to use their weapons even though it could create a catastrophe for us as large as the lost war in Afghanistan or the lost war in Iraq. As is typical, over the past week, the New York Times has published brain-dead editorials calling for this kind of aggression, a new $1 trillion war. Brett Steffens is a classic idiot, frankly. But the New York Times has also published really valuable reporting, some high-level leaks from the Trump administration, who knows, quite plausibly from Donald Trump himself, or perhaps approved by him, or perhaps not, though I would expect it to be approved by him because it actually puts Donald Trump in a really positive light, makes him look a lot smarter than the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment. Anyway, this was published recently in the New York Times. The title is Trump waved off Israeli strike after divisions emerged in his administration. It's a complicated way of saying that Israel and the United States military-industrial complex cooked up an absurd plan that was pretty much guaranteed to fail, to destroy Iran's capacity to build a nuclear weapon. It would kill a bunch of Iranians. It would make Iran very angry. It would drag us into a $1 trillion war. It would probably kill a bunch of U.S. soldiers, but it wouldn't actually keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon. In fact, many believe that, it's not in this New York Times article, but many believe that these strikes would actually make a Iranian nuclear bomb much more likely. And crucially, and this was sort of the deal breaker, I think, for Donald Trump himself, or certainly elements in the Trump administration, Israel is absolutely not capable of doing this by themselves. They needed heavy U.S. support. And CENTCOM, the United States Central Command, a luxury item for the United States military-industrial complex that has wasted at least $6 trillion over the past 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan, has worked with the Israeli government to cook up this detailed plan about how we were going to launch our next $1 trillion mistake in the Middle East. And Donald Trump and some people in his administration, folks that I'm not usually having a ton of respect for, but certainly do today, Tulsi Gabbard, J.D. Vance, some other folks, essentially said, why would we do this? And there's some magical moments in this New York Times article talking about Netanyahu, who supposedly came to talk to Trump about tariffs, actually came to try to convince him, to try and bully him into carrying out these strikes, starting this war in May. And Donald Trump made him sit down in public as he announced that he was going to have discussions with Iran, which is very, very satisfying for me. But I don't think that should underemphasize the amount of threat that we are dealing with here. I get some guff from some of my constant commenters about how I'm constantly Chicken Little. I'm constantly talking about, war with Iran is just around the corner. Well, that's the thing. In Washington, D.C.'s mind, in Washington, D.C.'s wishes, urges, they want war with Iran to be right around the corner. And certainly the context that we have seen over the past couple of years of Biden and Trump with his war in Yemen is the war hawks in the United States and Israel getting everything that they want. So we continue to be at very, very high risk of war with Iran. And it's great. You should all take a look at this New York Times article. It's good reading. It lays out very clearly who the good guys in the Trump administration are and who the bad guys are. Not folks we may like on other policies, but there are people in the Trump administration who are trying to keep us out of another $1 trillion war. Those folks should be celebrated, even Donald Trump himself on this topic. But the risks are still incredibly high. The National Security Advisor, who clearly has some sort of relationship with Jeffrey Goldberg at the fanatically pro-war Atlantic magazine. The National Security Advisor is very pro-war, as is illustrated in this article. It's clear that some folks who are more anti-war are being fired from the Trump administration as we speak. The possibility of war remains very, very real. So I thought it would be worth revisiting some videos of mine from 2018 and 2019 that just talk about how catastrophic, how potentially disastrous this war would be for the United States. And I think these videos hold up in some respects and do not in others, and we'll discuss that. One other note about the main video that we're going to be deconstructing, it's called How the U.S. War with Iran Will Go. And it's fascinating because this video is from December of 2018, and it's shocking how similar the conversation here is to what the conversation is here today. There is sort of desperate hope that Donald Trump will actually carry through on some of the peaceful things that he has said. I ended up being quite disappointed by this video. In this video, Trump had announced he was taking troops out of Syria. In fact, that did not happen at any point during the Trump administration. But it's that same dynamic right now. It's almost 7 years later, and we're in kind of the exact same place, where will Trump actually follow through and bring the kind of peace that he's been promising since 2015. I remain pretty dubious about the possibility of that. But anyway, let's get into the video.
Hey there. So this is how the U.S.'s next multi-trillion-dollar war was supposed to start. And this is also how the next couple decades were supposed to go. At some point in the 2030s or 2020s or even 2019, a whole bunch of American soldiers were supposed to die. That's what the U.S. presence in Syria is all about, and that's why U.S. soldiers were permanently stationed there in 2017. To die. Seriously, that's the policy here. Nobody has come out and said it directly, but folks from John Bolton to Mike Pompeo have made it very clear. Let me connect the dots. As of last week, the U.S. troops were intended to be in Syria until Iran and Assad were not.
So one amazing thing about the new Trump administration is that neither John Bolton nor Mike Pompeo are there. John Bolton is, of course, the father of the North Korean nuclear program. He was a player during the Bush administration. He is a lunatic who just wants war with everybody all the time, yet is also constantly invited to all the major mainstream media news shows as if he's a sane person with worthwhile things to say. He famously fell out with Donald Trump during the Trump administration. He's not actually a particularly effectual or worthwhile character. It's obvious for the best that he's not employed. What's much, much better is that Mike Pompeo, a figure who looked to be having a good relationship with Donald Trump and likely to be in this second administration, is the war hawk of all war hawks. He is not in the administration, and that's fantastic. But National Security Advisor Michael Waltz is still there throughout the State Department. Marco Rubio is still there. There are tons of folks who want to invade everything. So yeah, things are better, but it's not as good as it could be. Now let's get to something that I got very wrong.
As of last week, the U.S. troops were intended to be in Syria until Iran and Assad were not. As the past 7 years have made very clear, those guys aren't going anywhere without a full-on invasion.
So I was wrong about that. Assad and Iran are out of Syria. Like, they are gone. And the Syrian government is very, very interested in working with both the United States and, more quietly, Israel to make sure that neither Assad nor Iran ever come back to Syria. Of course, Israel is unprompted now bombing the new Syrian government that defeated their old Assad regime enemy, but that's a completely different problem. Kettle of worms we won't get into today. What I think is worth mentioning here is that, to my surprise, and I am rarely surprised in geopolitics, the Shia crescent is gone. That central link of Syria is no longer available to Iran. They can no longer directly supply their militias in Lebanon, the Hezbollah militias, which also had been dealt a great defeat by Israel. Israel could not do the things that Jared Kushner was fantasizing about in October of 2024 when Hezbollah's leadership had been decapitated and sort of, take a big swaths of territory in Lebanon or anything like that. But Israel did inflict a large series of wounds on Hezbollah, and Hezbollah can't resupply because the Shia crescent is gone. The approach of the military-industrial complex, both Republican and Democrat, is like, now's the moment. Now we can finally finish the job. And by finishing the job, they're talking about taking on a task that is significantly larger against a significantly stronger element than what the Bush administration did in 2003 in Iraq, which would inevitably be vastly more destructive to U.S. prestige, to the lives of U.S. soldiers. The Iranians actually have missiles that work, unlike Saddam Hussein and his Scuds. And just really present the potential of a precipitous drop in U.S. prestige and success, and would cost $1 trillion in a period of time where we do not have those $1 trillion. So it's not even challenged. It's not challenged in the New York Times. It's not challenged in Fox News. It's not challenged anywhere. This idea that we've won, so we should now go further. No, we've won. Iranian influence has been largely demolished across the Middle East. They no longer call the shots anywhere. They've got the Houthis, but the Houthis do their own thing. Their threat to the United States has been demolished. Their threat to our proxy state, Israel, has been demolished. And if they're willing to do a nuclear deal, this issue is solved. But Washington, D.C.'s instinct is actually to be like, oh, damn it. It's so annoying that Assad fell down without us being able to use all these bombs and missiles and whatnot. So Washington, D.C. wants to grab defeat from the jaws of victory on the Iran file by starting something that's going to be quite nightmarish. And here's one idea of how that could go.
As the past 7 years have made very clear, those guys aren't going anywhere without a full-on invasion. And a whole bunch of dead U.S. soldiers is what Washington, D.C. needs to launch that invasion. It doesn't have to be all 2,000 to 4,000 of the American soldiers that are there. Just a couple hundred would do the trick. It could be a spare missile from Iran or Russia, or maybe a concerted attack from Hezbollah or some other militia. Whatever. Dead Americans will give Washington, D.C.'s morons what they need to start the U.S.'s final war in the Middle East. Now, we haven't even begun paying for their last multi-trillion-dollar disasters yet. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan represent a solid fifth to a third of U.S. national debt. So no matter how much MSNBC or Fox News may fantasize about invading Iran, we can't afford that sort of thing anymore. No, the U.S. war with Iran will be fought over the massed corpses of hundreds of thousands more dead Syrians and Iraqis. The first month or so will go great. U.S. defense contractors will make hundreds of billions of dollars. Chicken hawks from Jake Tapper to Max Boot will get exactly the sorts of images that they think U.S. power is made of. Everyone wearing an Iranian uniform in Iraq or Syria will be slaughtered, and only a few tens of thousands more innocent civilians will die in the crossfire. Assad and his whole family will die horribly in the streets, and whatever sociopath is U.S. president at that point will congratulate everyone for a job well done. Then the second month will start. Against Washington, D.C.'s predictions, the Iranian people will strangely fail to turn friendly after we kill all their sons in Syria. Iran's President Rouhani and anybody else who ever tried to negotiate with the United States will probably get the Assad treatment. Iran will finally become the massive state sponsor of terrorism that the U.S. has always claimed it was. If there's anything left of the Iraqi government, it will turn against us as well. The moderate jihadists in Syria who failed to unify to fight Assad will definitely unify to fight the U.S. occupiers. Sunni and Shia, Arab and Kurd, and probably even Turk. Everyone will get together to kill U.S. soldiers. Millions of civilians will die to kill tens of thousands of our soldiers. By the first year, we should be at Vietnam levels of casualties. The horror show will almost certainly spread to Lebanon, Jordan, and other countries. The EU will finally splinter completely under refugee flows that will dwarf those the United States created in 2015. The world will fall to pieces as the U.S. president feebly shouts at everybody that this is all Iran's fault.
So I'm not as confident in this particular disaster scenario as I was when I made this video back in 2018. Assad is gone. The Shia crescent has been demolished, and that proved to be a lot easier. I mean, it took a decade, it took 500,000 lives, but it proved to be easier for the United States to do than I expected. It was something that the United States was capable of doing, and plausibly, maybe fewer people will be killed in a war between the United States and Iran that attempts to scoop out the Iraqi militias. Certainly, tons of U.S. soldiers would die. Certainly, it would cost tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. But then if we do that, we're sort of left in the same situation I'm talking about there. Okay, so what are we gonna invade Iran? Of course we're not going to invade Iran. There's no world. I mean, that's as ridiculous as pretending we're going to do a naval battle with China over Taiwan. It is financially completely impracticable. And there's another disaster situation here. There's another potential nightmare situation that I talked about in a video from 2019 that talks about the situation of Saudi Arabia, which is very interesting because for years, up until 2019, in fact, Saudi Arabia lobbied very hard for the United States to go to war with Iran. They've got some religious differences that ended up not really amounting to much. They've got some questions about who's going to run the region. But Saudi Arabia actually realized a couple months after I published this clip, that actually war with Iran is really, really, really not in their interest. And this is a catastrophic scenario that I believe has actually been confirmed since I made this video clip in 2019.
The United States just doesn't have the resources necessary to do an invasion of Iran anymore. But there will be plenty of blood and horror to go around as the U.S. loses thousands of soldiers and kills hundreds of thousands in Iraq and Syria.
What Saudi Arabia is banking on is the mess in another theater, the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The hope is that Kuwaiti, Iraqi, and Iranian production will be completely shut down due to fights in the Strait, while Saudi Arabia can continue to produce and send oil out through its Red Sea ports and the Suez Canal. This would create a massive spike in oil prices and massive profits for the Saudis. And that could be exactly what happens. But I think Saudi Arabia may be relying on too many things going exactly right. Iran has a ton of missiles, and in the context of a real, full-on war, those missiles would be flying everywhere. Also, unlike Saddam Hussein, Iran isn't dumb enough to try to engage the United States in full-on tank battles or aerial dogfights. They've had decades to prepare for a very asymmetric kind of warfare, and who knows what surprises are in store. This cozy scenario of Saudi profit relies on the U.S. preserving perfect air superiority over a pretty large area. The Iranians only have to get lucky once. What if one of the thousands of missiles they send at U.S. ships hits its target? What if they manage to take out a U.S. fighter jet with a swarm of off-the-shelf Walmart drones? The U.S. is going to be very focused on making sure that these things don't happen, but if they do, the resources dedicated to protecting the Saudi oil bonanza will evaporate. Despite what the U.S. government tells you, the Iranians and their Houthi allies have been very, very restrained. In a real war, a lot of stuff can get broken very quickly. And it's not like those Texas Republicans would be heartbroken if one of those thousands of Iranian missiles blew up a few Saudi pipelines. Also, there is the inconvenient fact that a lot of Saudi production is in areas with a lot of Shia. Especially if a few U.S. fighters or destroyers go down, the line between the Iraqi bloodlands and Saudi Arabia's oil heartland will get very shaky. It's only a 6-hour drive from southern Iraq to Saudi Arabia's most important oil installations. It's certain that no Iranian tank will be able to make it that far, but how about Iran-affiliated Iraqi militiamen in thousands of Toyota pickup trucks? That'd be harder to stop. So I published that video on June 20th, 2019. On September 14th, 2019, the Iranians and the Houthis carried out an attack on Saudi Arabia's oil industry that very briefly took like half of their production offline. And that one attack proved to Saudi Arabia what I was saying. And Saudi Arabia's behavior has changed almost miraculously. If you look at commentary from, say, 2015 or 2005, it looked like it was this immutable fact of the Middle East that Saudi Arabia and Iran, they hated each other forever. People wrote books calling it the new 30 Years' War, this, that, and the other thing. But with that one attack in 2019, it was very clearly demonstrated in 2019 and to the Saudi government, and the Saudi government internalized this, that they would not survive a serious war between the United States and Iran. So Saudi Arabia started taking actions to deal with that, started working in 2019 to get back on Saudi Arabia's good side. You may recall that there was a big to-do about China brokering a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That was mostly Saudi Arabia looking to embarrass Joe Biden. This was a long-standing dynamic. Today, Saudi Arabia and Iran actually have flourishing diplomatic relations. I believe they've reopened their embassies. They have their foreign ministers going back and forth. They converse. They talk about business deals and broader cooperation. It is an incredibly happy story, actually, that you don't really hear about in U.S. news much, because the complete demolition of this idea that Shias and Sunnis are eternal enemies, you don't hear about it much because it makes it harder to do war. The problem for Saudi Arabia here is Yemen, and the extent to which the United States and the Trump administration, even the better parts of the Trump administration, do not understand what's going on with Yemen, what's going on with Iran, and what would happen in the current setup if the United States chose to go to war with Iran. Saudi Arabia has gone to great lengths to get Iran on their side over the past 6 years, but it might not matter once the missiles start flying, because of decisions the Trump administration has already made with regards to Yemen's Houthi government. The Trump administration and Washington, D.C. in general deeply misunderstand the relationship between Yemen and Iran. Yemen's Houthi government has received weapons and money from Iran, but they are not some appendage of Iranian foreign policy. Yemen has its own interests and will act accordingly. And the Trump administration has gone to war against Yemen. The Trump administration's stepped-up bombing is just as ineffective as Biden's bombing was. And now there are strong rumors that the United States will start working with the shattered remnants of Yemen's old government to launch a ground war. The Saudis have been desperately trying to do deals with both Yemen and Iran for years now, but the shards of Yemen's old government are all heavily funded by the Saudis and the United Arab Emirates. If Trump uses those elements to launch a Yemen ground war, the Houthis will destroy Saudi Arabia's oil industry, no matter what Iran wants. All of Saudi Arabia's work to become friends with Iran will be useless if Trump drags them into a renewed war in Yemen. Yeah, did I mention that yet? It sort of complicates the vision of peaceful Trump, the fact that his administration is stepping up its war on Yemen, as was documented in that absurd Signalgate controversy a couple weeks back. If Saudi oil production is destroyed, if the whole Gulf petroleum megaplex becomes unusable, which I believe is very much the case, then we end up triggering that catastrophic situation that I described in this video from back in 2018.
The world will fall to pieces as the U.S. president feebly shouts at everybody that this is all Iran's fault. At some point, the madness will stop. Not because World War III will start, but because China, Japan, and what's left of Europe will finally stop buying U.S. debt. Forced to choose between Medicare and baby boomer power fantasies, the U.S. public will go with Medicare. The U.S. empire will evaporate. Our military forces will pull out of the Middle East, and then fiscal realities will require that it move out of Germany, Korea, Japan, and everywhere else as well. The other three branches of the U.S. military will be folded into the Coast Guard, in fact, if not in name. After yet another disastrous war, nobody will miss the U.S. military's international presence. Not at first, anyway. That's what was supposed to happen over the next couple decades, but last week, something funny happened. Donald Trump woke up and decided to pull out of Syria. Everybody in Washington, D.C. lost their minds, from CNN to Fox News, from Republican Lindsey Graham to Democrat Nancy Pelosi. All of Washington, D.C. thinks getting out of Syria is a terrible idea. Donald Trump is a lot of things, but he is not a creature of Washington, D.C. He sees U.S. troops in Syria for what they actually are. An invitation to a war the U.S. cannot afford, and an end to the U.S. ability to bully anybody. Donald Trump is not interested in giving away that power. The dark future I described in this video could still happen. All of Trump's generals and all of the adults in the room that are left are working hard to bring about this catastrophic war with Iran. It pains me to admit this, but on this topic, Donald Trump is right. And all of those hashtag resistance neocons are very, very wrong. You can debate whether or not this is a good thing, but if Donald Trump can pull this off, I think he may have just saved the American world order. I think the U.S. withdrawal from Syria, if it's allowed to happen, is an incredible thing for world peace, and I think it gives all of us a little more breathing space to build a better world. Donald Trump just gave the American people a Christmas present? Weird.
First off, who let me grow that beard? The 2018 was not my best year. As I'm struck by that vision of apocalypse for U.S. empire, I'm reminded of other U.S. empire-ending scenarios that we've been facing this spring, specifically Trump's Liberation Day and his somewhat abortive, was it abortive? Is it half successful? Is it possible to even know? Attempt to impose an entirely new tariff regime on the world. Donald Trump wants to do a bunch of things. Some of these are horrifically bad. Some of them are potentially useful. He's not going to be able to do any of those things if he drags us into another $1 trillion war with Iran. I think he might realize that. But we are getting into a point where that's not a lot to rely upon. The United States in the early 2000s caused incredible damage, incredible horror in the Middle East, but from the selfish perspective of a U.S. citizen, we could get away with it. We were so unquestionably powerful at that point that we could destroy a region with knock-on effects that actually ended up breaking up the European Union, producing Brexit because of refugee flows we'd created. We could do all this insanely disruptive stuff with zero consequences to the United States. I think the United States is still very powerful and can do a succession of insane things without causing tremendous damage to our long-term potential. Certainly cause tremendous damage to our long-term prestige, but we're still the United States. We're still a continent. We'll still probably be okay in the long run. But that's getting a lot more shaky in the late 2020s than it was in 2003. We are reaching a point where the risky, insane decisions that we take will have longer-term consequences for the United States. And first off, electing Trump in the first place, I would argue, was a rather risky choice, a bit of a gamble. And to try to do his tariff thing on top of trying to do a massive war in Iran thing would be absolutely insane. We should not do it. Do I think we will do it? I think we could. What do I put the chances at? Not 50-50, maybe not even 40-60. But if there's a 5% chance that we're going to do another $1 trillion war in the Middle East, we should act quickly to make sure that does not happen. We need to celebrate Donald Trump when he chooses to not go to war. We need to laugh along with Donald Trump when he makes Netanyahu uncomfortable by throwing out his war plans. We need to celebrate when if Donald Trump gets into the exact same nuclear deal that the Obama administration was in, that would be amazing. The important thing is to avoid another $1 trillion war in the Middle East for the United States. We just need to not do that. We could just not do that. And I know I've been talking about it for a decade. The risk that we will do that is uncomfortably high. Trump and some people in the Trump administration have positive instincts that we should encourage, but it's just crazy that there are still people in Washington, D.C. who are allowed to have jobs who think that a new war with Iran would be a good idea. These people should not be working in government. Ever again. Yeah. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you'd consider signing up on my Patreon, I'd be very grateful. It is crowdfunding through Patreon that keeps this channel going. Thanks so much.